Welcome to another episode of 10 Minute Philosophy, the show that's bringing the tools of critical thought to the internet 10 minutes at a time. According to my to-do list, today we're looking at philosophical terms, and the term of the day is philosophy itself. Well, that's kind of meta, isn't it? Alright, so let's get started by defining philosophy as the art of thinking about thinking, or the craft of deliberate and methodical reasoning. I say we take a two-pronged approach here and describe philosophy from both the practical and the full-on geeky philosophical side. And I say we start with the geeky side. So, all the branches of philosophy are centered on a specific set of questions about a specific number of issues. So take, for example, fields like ontology, epistemology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, phenomenology, and so on, are kind of like chemistry, biology, and physics in that they are prominent sub-branches that focus on specific topics. The difference is, the hard sciences are all focused on describing the physical world, whereas philosophy has a much broader scope. So then, let's take us back to the original question, what is philosophy? Well, let's start by looking at the first four fields that we listed here and see if we can use them to tease out the bigger picture. That would be ontology, metaphysics, epistemology, and logic. Now, it's important to understand that you can look at each one of these branches individually, but you can also look at them as kind of interwoven depending on the topic that you're focusing on. Let's try to tease them out a little bit and see if we can use them to gain some insight into what philosophy in general is about, starting with ontology. So ontology is said to be the science of being. What's meant by that is in order to start debating any topic at all, you have to begin with the claim that something exists, even if that claim is only implied in your argument. So the field of ontology, therefore, is concerned with the existence of things. Let's say, for example, that you wanted to argue that you exist. Well, that would be an ontological argument or an ontological claim. So the assertion that an object or a category or a concept exists is, at its base, an ontological claim. This is very similar to our next branch, metaphysics, which is said to be the study of what's called first principles. The basic idea here is that if you want to argue about the ultimate purpose or essence of a particular thing, or perhaps if you want to argue about the purpose of existence itself, you're making a metaphysical argument. So if you're arguing that you exist, that would be ontological. But if you wanted to argue that your existence implies that your human nature is inherently good, bad, or neutral, well then you've shifted from an ontological to a metaphysical argument. The line here is kind of blurry, but I think it's helpful to think of it as ontology is the what question, and metaphysics is the why question. Alright, so that's a good start. Let's look at our next two branches. So if ontology and metaphysics are the what and the why, maybe it might be helpful to think of epistemology as the how. As in, how can I know anything at all? That's because epistemology focuses on theories of knowledge. And the real trick here is to look at knowledge itself as a thing, and then investigate its properties. So epistemologists are concerned with the nature of knowledge, its possibility, and its scope, and they get all excited about classifying different categories of knowledge based off of their ideas about where knowledge comes from. Logic, on the other hand, is all about assessing truth claims once they've been established. So you'll find all types of different systems and techniques for building from one truth claim to another, and their primary focus is on maintaining a consistent method as they move from one idea to the next. Think about it like this. Epistemology is focused on understanding how we come to know things at all, and then logic picks it up from there and tells us how to build our ideas about that thing well. Alright, so that's a decent intro to the geeky side. Now let's start to take some consideration about the practical side. I'll be moving kind of fast here for the sake of brevity, so this will be a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's still a helpful first step. Let's think about in Western culture. We consider our basic ontology, the fundamental stuff of the universe, to be matter. So that would be our ontological position, or our metaphysical position, depending on who you ask. We also consider our perception to be the most reliable process for gaining information about the world, so our epistemology is based on direct observation through our senses. We take those first two notions and apply them using a consistent approach that we call the scientific method, and voila, we get all kinds of awesome stuff like physics and rockets and lasers and video games and so on. This, of course, is just one convenient example. Philosophers are more than willing to question every one of these positions in great depth. And so this is because philosophers, more than any other discipline, are dedicated to being reasonable. That being the case, let's take a peek now at the practical side of philosophy and ask what it means to be reasonable. You can think about being reasonable as having four main requirements. The first of these requirements is humility, or recognizing that any claim you make has to be falsifiable. You have to be willing to accept that you might be wrong about anything at all. And this is one of the things that really distinguishes philosophers from other disciplines, is philosophers are willing to take this shadow of doubt further than anyone else. You should also be willing to test your ideas and beliefs. This being the case, being really reasonable means that you should have a clear idea as to what would be needed to make you change your mind, and then the emotional fortitude to change your position if the proper counter-evidence is produced. Probably the best example in recent memory of this would be the debate between the scientists Bill Nye and Ken Ham on creationism back in February of 2014. At the end of the debate, the moderator asked, "What would cause you to change your mind?" And Bill Nye said, "Evidence," whereas Ken Ham said, "Nothing." Well, there you have it. Trying to argue that you have an infallible monopoly on the truth is, well, among other things, unreasonable. I mean, seriously, what do you do with that? Anyways, the second requirement is focus. And what we mean here is that you should be able to stay focused on the matter at hand. And this requires you to be able to distinguish the difference between ideas and identity. So, in other words, you should be able to call an idea into question without calling the person themselves into question. And you should be willing to have your ideas and beliefs questioned without feeling personally threatened. An easy way to think about this is, if a crazy person says 2 + 2 = 4, well, that statement's true regardless of the fact that they're crazy. So in philosophy, you should try and focus on the ideas and not the person, or any other facts that might not be directly connected with the idea in question. That is, you need to be able to stay focused on the exact topic at hand. Philosophers, particularly those working in logic, have cataloged hundreds of ways in which a debate can go off the rails by someone distracting their opponents by shifting the conversation. These shifts or distractions are called fallacies, and they're a lot of fun once you learn how to use them. They're kind of like mental kung fu. They let you cut through all the nonsense and keep the discussion on topic. Be sure to look at the links below to learn more about them. Anyways, moving on. There's the third requirement, and this one's a little dense. But basically, it just states that you have to be consistent with yourself and with others. Think about it as having 4 parts. The first of these 4 parts is that you have to support any claim that you make with some kind of evidence. And whatever you're using as evidence has to be available to both sides of the debate. The second rule is that you have to be logical, and what we mean here is that you have to be consistent in your approach. The bottom line is, you can't contradict yourself. The third rule is, you have to recognize the burden of proof. And this, of course, kind of takes us back to the initial ontological arguments that we started this video off with. In essence, the burden of proof means that whoever asserts the claim owns the claim. If you say something exists or that something is true, then you're the one that has to prove it. No one can ever be called upon to prove the non-existence of something because that's impossible, and it's also a fallacy, which we call shifting the burden. The last rule on our list is transparency. What we mean here is that whatever method you're using to reach whatever conclusion you're arguing for has to be something that you can explain and, depending on the case at hand, demonstrate. If you say that you just feel the answer inside of your guts, or that it's an instinct, or some inevitable self-revealed truth, well, that's great, and I'm glad you had that experience, but it's not reasonable for you to expect me to believe you. Take as, for example, if a doctor told me that he wanted to saw my skull open because he thought I had brain cancer, and I asked him what led him to that conclusion, and he said, I just feel it in my guts. Well, that would be a person that I would say is somewhat unreasonable, and also somebody that you should back away from slowly. The last rule that philosophers have to adhere to in order to be reasonable is that they have to be very, very patient. A philosopher has to be willing to work on one issue at a time. Philosophy, the issues in philosophy, the history of philosophy, and philosophers are an incredibly dense subject matter. It would be nice if somebody would come along and try to straighten out this spaghetti bowl of ideas by, I don't know, breaking it up into 10-minute YouTube videos. That would be cool, but seriously, who has time for that? Speaking of time, we're all up for today's episode. I hope that it was helpful for you to get some insight into the major fields of philosophy as well as the general tenets of being reasonable. Please be sure to check the doobly-doo down below for today's links and further information about the topics that we covered. And also, do a man a favor, hit that subscribe button. In the meantime, keep on thinking, and we'll see you next time.